So my brothers and my sisters, as we embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be loved. Love means understanding, redemptive goodwill toward all, which seeks nothing in return. So be loved by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be loved by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be loved and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be loved and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be loved and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be loved and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
Students with King serves as the King Center's flagship engagement platform for elementary, middle, and high school students, highlighting the legacies of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and the impact of the 20th century American Civil Rights Movement. Our dynamic and interactive programming has reached over 1 million students worldwide. Our core learning programs introduce students to the philosophy of Kingian nonviolence, coined Nonviolence 365, and provide important lessons about how they can apply nonviolence in their immediate environments. Whether you're an educator who is looking for ways to bring the King legacy into your classroom, a student who wants to learn more about this powerful moral movement, or a parent who wants to get your child involved in character building and literacy development activities, Students with King is your one-stop shop for unique lesson plans, teaching resources, educational field trips, and other opportunities to engage with the history of the American Civil Rights Movement and its powerful leaders. We look forward to engaging with you and your students. Together we can build the next generation of compassionate, courageous, and conscientious leaders.
Good morning. Welcome to this month's Student with King Interactive Civil Rights Talk. I'm excited about our program today. This month is Coretta Scott King, Ms. Coretta Scott King birth month, and we have an exciting program for you. Teachers, will you please get out your telephones, your iPads, because we would like for you to look at our QR code. And at this time, scan the QR code so that you can answer our questions that we have asked of you. So for next year, when we create the program, we can make sure the program is for you. At this time, I also like to say, on behalf of Dr. Bernice A. King and the King Center, thank you for joining us this morning. We are committed to making this beloved community a reality, and we can only do it with you, students. This program is an interactive program, and we need you to participate in. You must ask questions, so we will ask you to put your questions in the chat, and they will appear, and we will have the guests to answer that. However, we want you to continue to join us, and we want you to take the pledge that you heard earlier. We need you to be a part of this. Well, without further ado, I would like to get the program started. And I would like to introduce our moderator for the day. Our moderator is Ms. Cheryl Preham. Ms. Cheryl Preham, you probably see her every morning because she's up bright and early on 11 Alive News. So without further ado, let's welcome Ms. Cheryl Preham to the show.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be with you today. Thanks for everybody joining us. I know, Donald, we've got people from all over Georgia, around the country. You might even be joining us from other places around the world. That's one of the most incredible parts of the King Center's reach and impact that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. Coretta Scott King both had and continue to have through the King Center. So I'm so happy you're all with us. If you want to just pop in the chat where you're watching from, whether it's the country, the state, what high school you're with, we'd love to know where you're joining us from, and be sure to ask those questions. We want to make sure that we're answering what you'd like to know today, specifically about Mrs. Coretta Scott King. So India, I love that. Our first response is from India, all the way from India. I think that always touches me to really think about how far the reach is. Also from Kenya, Africa. That's awesome. Jose, I'm so glad you're with us. Thank you, everybody, for being part of today. We have a really special program for you today. We're going to be talking with Dr. Kelisha B. Graves. She's an impact-driven scholar, educator, speaker, author. She's an education impact strategist, and she is an expert on Mrs. Coretta Scott King. She's been interested in Mrs. King since she was 15 and been doing research ever since. And she has a wealth and depth of knowledge that she's going to share with us today. Also, some really impactful projects that you'll get to be a part of as well. So we want to start with a video talking about Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and you'll also get to meet Dr. Graves for the first time.
Welcome to our Students with King Nonviolence Spotlight Series. I'm Kelisha Graves, but my students call me Professor Graves. I'm a teacher, and I really enjoy helping students learn more about the life and impact of Mrs. Coretta Scott King. Coretta Scott King is commonly known as the wife and widow of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But what I want you to know is that she was a woman of substance and commitment. Yes, that's right. Mrs. King was a leader and a world changer in her own right. Mrs. King was a leader, a wife, and a mother. She fought for freedom, and she inspired Dr. King to fight for freedom. And because of her, we have the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change. She was also the driving force behind the National King Holiday, which is celebrated every third Monday in January. Yes, you guessed it, Mrs. King was awesome. Coretta Scott was born on April 27, 1927, in Heiberger, Alabama, to Obadiah Scott and Bernice McMurray Scott. As a young person, she attended the Lincoln High School. Later, she attended Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, where she majored in music and elementary education. After leaving Antioch College, she attended the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, Massachusetts, where she majored in voice and violin. While studying at the New England Conservatory of Music, she met Martin Luther King Jr. Mrs. King and Dr. King had a common interest in social justice and activism. Together, they committed their lives to bring about peace and justice through nonviolent social change.
The world is in dire need of a spiritual awakening which will make those eternal values of love, justice, mercy, and peace meaningful in our time.
Mrs. King was not only important to the civil rights movement, of which she and her husband were central leaders, but she was also a leader in the global fight for social justice.
Dr. Graves, I'm so glad you're with us today. I've already learned just from that video, I didn't realize she had studied voice and violin. I love that you can give us such a deep perspective of who she was and the impact she continues to have. Thank you for being with us today. We appreciate it so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So tell us a little bit about your connection with the King Center.
Yeah. So currently I serve as a Chief Research Education and Programs Officer at the King Center. But of course, my genealogy, if you will, with the King Center begins almost 17 years ago now, when I was 15 years old. And I think this is a true statement. Most young people's entry point to the King legacy comes through the person of Martin Luther King Jr. So, I was a student in the American school system. We learned about Black history and all, civil rights movement in school, but my particular interest was in Mrs. King, actually, more than Dr. King. And it was during the King holiday in 2006, early January. And of course, we were out of school, like every other young person in the U.S. Celebrating the federal King holiday. And I was actually in my bedroom studying something else because I've always been oriented to history. And so I remember distinctly at that time, I was studying something related to film history. I wanted to be a film historian at one point. And my father was in another room watching a program called Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. Now, this was a show that I had absolutely no interest in as a 15-year-old. But my father, during the King holiday, they were showing clips of Martin Luther King Jr. speeches and showing clips of the Selma to Montgomery March in particular. And so my dad forced me to come into the room and watch this program with him. And I'm like, I don't want to watch this, right? Like, this is the same stuff we hear every year, marching, speeches. I was not interested. But again, they were showing these clips of the Selma to Montgomery March, and I kept seeing Mrs. King in each of the frames. And immediately a question came to me, and I tell my students this all the time, that don't try to give me the right answer. I want you to be able to ask the right question that will lead you to the next level of insight. And so the question I asked, my research question at that time, is, if Mrs. King was there, why didn't I know about it? And so I immediately, after that program was over, my parents had a separate office space in our home, and I got on my little Windows computer and Internet Explorer at the time and tried to pull up, right, as much information as I could on Mrs. King. And again, this is early January 2006. So this is a couple of weeks actually before Mrs. King passed. Mrs. King passed on January 30th. So my interest literally began several weeks before she passed. Couldn't find a lot of information on Mrs. King at all at that time. So went to the local library to get as many books as I could find on Mrs. King. There wasn't a lot. There were only children's books at the time. And so check those books out. And then I also went to my school library, and we just so happened to have at that time Mrs. King's first autobiography called My Life with Martin Luther King Jr. And so I had kind of this small collection of books, which I never returned back to the library. So I had a running bill. I had a running bill with my local library. And as a matter of fact, so I had a running bill with my local library, but then also my school library, I never returned Mrs. King's autobiography until like 2015.
It's a good investment.
Right. Right. So, and I graduated high school in 2008. So you can see how long I kept the book. So that's really how my interest, it literally started from seeing her on a program. And after that, I actually ended up writing a letter to Martin Luther King and Mrs. King's daughter, Yolanda King, who was the oldest of the 4 King children. I wrote her a letter. I was in the 9th grade at the time. And check this out. I put my phone number at the bottom of the letter, right? I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know what.
It was a landline.
Right. I put my phone number at the bottom of the letter, and I sent it off, and I was praying. I was like, Lord, please let Miss King get my letter. And sent it to California, and she received my letter, and her office called the phone number that I put at the bottom of the letter. And they invited me to Atlanta when I was 15, met Miss King, had a tour of the King Center, and literally the rest is history.
Oh my gosh, I have goosebumps because that shaped your life, and now you're pouring into us what they poured into you at 15.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
That is, wow. I guess when you say things are meant to be, that is certainly the case. And I just want to say thanks to your dad for making you watch that program.
Right.
Because I loved what you said, Dr. Graves, about ask the right question for the next level of insight, because that's what we're all doing together here. So here's a reminder, type in a question if you've got one, and we'll pop them on the screen. And as they do, Dr. Graves can answer them. Oh boy, there's so much I want to say. I think I'm a mom of 4, and there's so many times I've thought about Mrs. King as a mother, because that framed everything that she saw the world that way. But then you think about like every sacrifice she and Dr. King made, also they made, as a family, because as they faced threats and violence and that was coming at young children too. And I think the courage and the strength of a mom to say, this is so much bigger than me and our family, really stands out to me.
Yeah, most definitely. And also let me add this as kind of an addendum to my story from earlier. I lost the fear of no early in life. And it took a lot of courage to be able to write that letter to someone who didn't know me, right? And Martin Luther King's daughter at that. So if there's any advice I could give to young people, it would be to lose the fear of no early. Once you lose the fear of no, right, then all of your courage and all of that persistence can flow in the way that it needs to. So I'll tell you this: when I started my research on Mrs. King, a part of me losing the fear of no, part of my research trajectory was to interview everybody who I could find the new Mrs. King. So I was literally, at the time, you could get people's numbers from like 411.com. I was literally looking up people's phone numbers, right? Family members' phone number. And I was literally cold calling people and like, hey, my name is Kelisha Graves. I'm doing research on Mrs. King. Are you willing to talk to me? And people are like, who is this? Who is this kid? Right. But and I remember one of the people I called was actually Mrs. King's older sister. Her name was Mrs. Edith Scott Bagley. And I'll never forget the first time I called Miss Bagley. It was like a random Saturday or something like that. Found her number, called her, and she said, I said, can I interview you? And she's like, no, I don't do interview for press. And so I said, okay. Again, I wasn't offended because, again, the worst someone can say to me is no. So she said no. And I said, okay, yes, ma'am, thank you. Before I hung up the phone, she said, wait a minute. What's your name? I said, Kelisha Graves. She said, what are you doing? I said, I'm researching, your sister. I want to be the first person to do a scholarly work on Mrs. King. And she said, okay, call me on Sunday here. And I called her, and literally that started a several years, long relationship up until she passed with Mrs. King's older sister. So I lost the fear of no early in life.
That is something I hope everybody who's with us writes down, holds on to, because for all the reasons you could have thought you'd never get a call or a yes from Mrs. King's sister, there was a yes, and it was like these pivotal moments that shaped the next moment, and you never know if you don't ask, and you never know what could be if you don't put yourself out there. And I appreciate your courage to do that, and I love how that can inspire all of us, no matter our age, to say it does not hurt to ask, know, and what could happen when the yes does happen.
That's right. Yeah, it can change your life.
Oh man, Professor Graves dropping all kinds of knowledge today. It's so cool. Listen, there was a time on stage at a King Center event that Dr. Bernice King said to me, a lot of people were asking questions about her father. Understandably, like you said, there's been so much written and said. We see so many incredible, impactful clips about moments in time. And she just said to the group, she said, I really want you to know about my mother too. She had an integral part. She was such a key player then. And she said, and none of us would be sitting in this auditorium without my mother. And I think there is something so important about knowing even how she carried on and some really monumental things she accomplished after Dr. King's assassination. Yeah.
Most certainly. I mean, Mrs. King really was a trailblazer in so many respects, even before she met Martin Luther King Jr. It's amazing. Martin Luther King Jr. did not have to teach Coretta Scott, the then Coretta Scott, about how to care about humanity, about social justice, right? About peace. These are actually issues and concerns that preoccupied her young brain from an early age. So Mrs. King was a trailblazer in so many respects. I mean, as an institution builder, right? We commonly think about Mrs. King as the young mother who is unfairly rendered alone by an assassin's bullet. That's kind of the dominant framing through which most people understand Mrs. King. But in fact, this is a woman who's an institution builder, who's a thinker, who has intellectual prowess. One of the questions that I taught African American history, of course, in African American history, and I would always start out my classes with this question. When you think about historical African Americans, what comes to mind? And most young people would say civil rights, slavery, Jim Crow, brutality, all of these kind of what we might see as pathologies that are associated with Blackness. And so we would create this word cloud. And every semester it would always happen. The one word that never made it onto the word cloud was thinker. Nobody ever said, I think about African American people as thinkers in the world. And so even when it comes to Mrs. King, I start from that premise. This was a woman who was not just a doer. She did an innumerable amount of remarkable things, but she was also a thinker. We call her at the King Center the architect of the King legacy. In order to be an architect, in order to know how to bring different pieces and parts together to create something new, you have to be a thinker. You have to be someone who is deeply reflective. You have to be someone who has a perspective on the world, right? You have to be someone who can see beyond your immediate circumstance. And that's Mrs. King was able to do that even as a young person.
As you were talking, I'm thinking, because she's a thinker, it allowed her to be a visionary.
Yes.
And the King Center is so much a part of being a visionary, because she's talking about how do we not just continue, but we grow. Stephanie's giving you applause. It's so true. It's so true. Because the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia, for those of you who are joining us from India and Kenya, and we invite you to come. I hope you can come and experience the beauty and the power and the impact of this place, because that was part of what you're saying. She was a thinker and a visionary, thinking about what would happen generations to come, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren.
Yeah, she really envisioned the King Center as an educational institution. People don't realize that Mrs. King was an educator. Her degree, when she was at Antioch College, she was studying elementary education and music. People don't ever think about that. So when you look at kind of this long trajectory of her life and many of the causes and activities to which she applied herself, it should come at no surprise that a lot of her life was about educating people. How do we scale impact? You scale impact precisely through the activity of teaching, right? Of teaching and learning. So Mrs. King at her core was an educator. Even when you look at some of the things she did during the movement, for instance, a lot of people don't know Mrs. King was a singer. Like, that was her goal in life. She wanted to be concert singer until Martin Luther King Jr. kind of came and showed her another way. Right? She's like, I was not trying to marry a minister, but her initial goal was to be a singer. And one of the folks, or a couple of the folks she admired, were people like Marian Anderson, Roland Hayes, and Paul Robeson. Those were her kind of heroes in terms of musicians when she was growing up. And so during the movement, she created this concept that was modeled off of what Paul Robeson used to do. And she called it the Freedom Concert, where she literally taught the story of the civil rights movement as it in its current phase up until that time, right? She taught the story of the movement through song, through poetry, through recitation. So really, that is a public education effort. So she's even thinking beyond the borders of the classroom. Although she had experience in the classroom, she's also thinking, what does education look like in a public space? And she does that through the Freedom Concert. So when even as we reflect on Mrs. King, it's not like, oh, okay, did the Freedom Concert, singing, that's nice. No, it literally is a massive public education effort, which brings the African American story to the broader to a broader audience, if you will. So Mrs. King was, as you can tell, Mrs. King was absolutely extraordinary.
Absolutely. We would not be having this conversation on this platform without her, which is amazing. I was thinking, just as you were talking about the importance of music to her and the passion she had for music, just what a integral part music played in the movement, whether it was getting together at Brown Chapel before they marched across Edmund Pettus Bridge. That was such a deep part of the movement too. So
Absolutely.
it's neat to understand what that meant to her personally too.
Yeah, it's amazing. If I could just say this, when you look at music and song and dance in the African American experience, it's a carryover from the continent, right? It's a carryover from Africa. There's a playwright by the name of August Wilson. I love everything that also August Wilson does. And he says, Black folks don't sing the blues to feel better. They sing the blues because it's a way of understanding life. So when you look at song and dance and the musical tradition, even within the civil rights movement, it's not just singing to be singing, right? Or singing because we like the songs. It's singing because it's a way of understanding life. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on.
No, I love that. I was thinking back, and a reminder, as people have questions, be sure to send them in. We want to make sure we're addressing everything that you might have on your mind. I was thinking back to your conversations with Mrs. King's oldest sister. In those conversations, was there something that stood out? I'm sure there's so much she was able to share with you, just as having that sibling relationship, those, intimate conversations they must have had and the connections they had. Are there a few things that stood out to you the most and maybe surprised you the most that she shared with you?
Yeah, most definitely. Miss Bagley was a remarkable person. She was actually an educator herself. She taught at Cheney University, which is a historically Black college. And so Miss Bagley was remarkable. I remember after I kind of did my initial official interviews with her, I would usually call her on Sundays. But I remember during one of our first conversations, again, at that time, all I had available to me were kind of these children's books on Mrs. King. And I said something in the interview about what was it like growing up poor or something like that. And she immediately corrected me. She said, "We were not poor," right? She said that's a misstatement that's out there, that somehow Mrs. King just grew up incredibly impoverished, and that actually wasn't the case. Her father was a business owner. He owned a sawmill at one point, a grocery store. So she was very adamant about people getting the record straight, right? And so I just remember very, very vividly her saying we were not poor, but also just in those conversations, understanding the commitment to education, how they saw education, the impact of their parents in terms of how they thought about what uplift meant, not just for themselves, but for the broader community. So there was this real sense that we get education not exclusively for ourselves, but rather we get education in order to build up our community. And so she was very keen on that. There are just so many things when I think about it.
We all are familiar with that circle, aren't we? After the last couple of years that happened. So we'll get Dr. Graves back here shortly. As she was talking, I was thinking about how powerful it is when you think about Dr. Bernice King now, who of course is the CEO of the King Center, is the youngest child of Mrs. Coretta Scott King, that she is all of these things that her mother had held closely and felt were important, and so much of who her mother was in terms of a visionary, an educator, and then she's also a minister like her father. It's like these impactful parts of both her parents that she carries on today through the King Center and behind the pulpit and in front of students and really in front of the world, that she does every day. And I think that's really important to reflect on, and really why we can understand why she would say, hey, I want people to know, yes, absolutely, about everything my father did, but also about my mother. There was a time that Dr. Bernice King invited Mrs. Coretta Scott King's accountant to an event at the King Center to talk to students, and something he said really stood out to me. Dr. Graves, I'm glad you're back. I was just sharing a story about how Dr. Bernice King had invited Mrs. Coretta Scott King's personal accountant to speak to kids one day, and I was there to listen. And he told this story that he wanted kids to understand because she was, like you said, an educator, and it was so important to her knowledge. She understood the power of knowledge. And so she said, hey, I hadn't been necessarily the one keeping the books, but I understand how money is a driver of what we want to accomplish. And she said, so I want you to teach me. And she said, and if I don't understand, I'm going to ask you. And if I still don't understand, I'm going to ask you again, because I want to make certain that I know clearly so that I can absorb it and then share it and make decisions based on that knowledge. And he was just talking about the courage that she had to say if she didn't know, because she wanted to know, because she understood that knowledge was a key.
Yeah, very much so. And even today, I can say that's a trait that her daughter, Dr. Bernice King, has inherited as well. One of the things that I love about Dr. King is that she will ask questions, and so I can definitely say that's something that she inherited from her mother, because she really seeks to understand. So that's a great story.
I love that. That shared so much. Will you tell a little bit about the hashtag Dear Coretta project that you recently worked on, and maybe share a little bit about that with all of us?
Yeah. So recently, the King Center partnered with Microsoft to bring to the world for the first time ever this digital exhibition on the life and legacy of Mrs. King, and also the growth and development of the King Center, which Mrs. King lovingly called her fifth child, if you will. So
Wow.
that project we're really excited about. Again, it's our first digital exhibition. So what that means is the same way you go into a museum and you see physical exhibitions. Of course, we know through COVID and the pandemic has really forced everyone around the world to scale in different ways. It may not always be possible to physically go to a museum, right? But everyone at the same time can log on to a digital exhibit. And so even for those who are tuning in around the world, I know you mentioned we had some folks from Kenya and
Yeah.
from India, right? Even if they're not able to make the trek physically to the King Center, fortunately we have a digital exhibition that people around the world can tap into to learn more about Mrs. King, certainly, and then also the King Center.
That's good. I just was thinking about something, Dr. Graves. I'd love to see if you could share more about this. I think it's always good to remind ourselves, like, how young, Dr. King was when he was assassinated. So Mrs. King was a young woman with 4 young children. And I think it's just worth, like, taking a breath and soaking that in, because despite that and what they had been through up to that point, she did have that vision that she carried on. It was not an easy lift. It was still very difficult, but she was able to accomplish incredible things while raising a young family, juggling all that she had going. I just wonder, in any of these amazing conversations you had, did any of them share with you, those times where she spoke about what it was like to carry that kind of a burden and the weight of just life circumstances? I think we can all, think about different things that might feel heavy in life. And when you really step back and think about everything as a young woman that she was doing at that time, I just wonder, like, how did she do that? How did she do it?
So there's 2 ways to answer that. The first one is one of the things that really emerged in speaking with people who knew her, but also reading Mrs. King's own words. She has 2 autobiographies. First, My Life with Martin Luther King Jr., and then the second is My Life, My Love, My Legacy. Mrs. King was a mission-oriented person. And when you are a mission-oriented person, there's an inordinate amount of courage that kind of goes along with that. So the first answer is Mrs. King was incredibly mission oriented in terms she understood that there was a goal she was striving for, but also she had this kind of conviction that her life wasn't her own. She comes out of a family that prioritized service to community. And so she thereby not only commits her commits herself to service to her immediate community, but also to broader humanity. So she is extremely and particularly mission oriented in terms of her mindset. Also, Mrs. King was also a woman of faith. And that's something that cannot be overstated. Even as we talk about Martin Luther King Jr., Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor. In fact, you read his works, he all he ever really wanted to be was just a great pastor. But he kind of had this broader public ministry through the civil rights movement. But both Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., and Mrs. King were people of an inordinate amount of faith, and they believed in this idea that unearned suffering is redemptive. And you spoke about how young they were. I mean, they're in their like 20s, right? Their mid 20s when the movement first gets started. And to kind of have this mindset that if I have to give my life to this cause, I'm willing to do that is something that is absolutely extraordinary. I think, there are people who like the idea of being committed to the cause, but how many people are willing to die for a cause? And that is something, but again, that's connected to this kind of Judeo-Christian idea of unearned suffering is redemptive, and that there's value in that. So first answer to that is Mrs. King was a mission-oriented person. And the second answer is she was a woman of extraordinary faith and understood that that whatever work God completed in her life, he would bring it to completion. Or whatever work God started in her life, I'm sorry, that he would bring it to completion.
Yeah. And wow, that's a beautiful way to describe it, because she was mission oriented and she believed God had put her on this earth for a mission.
Yeah.
That's because I was thinking as you were talking, Dr. Graves, if we can just think about, if we're the ones sitting in a home with 4 little kids and a brick comes through the window and death threats and the kinds of, like, every day you have to choose to keep going. Every day you have to choose the greater good. And then after her husband is assassinated, she still chose that. And she still, builds and does and instills that in her children. Oh, here we have a question here, Dr. Graves. Where do you see the King Center vision in the next 5 years?
Wow, that's definitely a question for the CEO, because all of the work that I do at the King Center is in alignment with the CEO's ultimate vision. But certainly we, committed to empowering if I could use it in this phrase, an army of conscientious and courageous leaders who embody Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolence and are able to apply that in whatever their area of life endeavor is. So in alignment with both the current CEO's vision and Mrs. King's vision, we want to continue to disseminate the philosophy and methodology of nonviolence so that people can apply it in their personal lives.
And sometimes it's the how. And Dr. Bernice King had said recently in a group of high school kids, use the example of nonviolence in a setting where there might be a school fight, and do you choose to record it and post it? Do you choose to encourage, separate, like what choices you make? And to me, it brought it down to such a relatable level. Like there are choices we make every day in our lives, and that is like a tangible example, even in the halls of a high school right now.
Yeah, very much so. And the chain of violence has to stop somewhere, right? And that's really kind of the idea. You look at Dr. King and Mrs. King's life, despite the kind of physical violence that they endured themselves, right? They weren't willing to reciprocate that same violence. And I think that's really the power of nonviolence. It causes you to stop to think twice, right? To say, okay, what is my role at this moment? Should I pull out my phone and like record the situation and put it online to generate followers and create a buzz, right? What action will I take at this moment? So yes, I think for young people, if they want to understand, well, how is it what's the first step I can take in terms of nonviolence? It should empower you to stop to think twice about what should my reaction or response be in this moment.
Yeah. Am I diffusing or fueling?
Right. Right.
Right. Well, I know we're getting close to the end of our time together. If anyone has a question, I would encourage you to go ahead and type it in. And I would ask you, Dr. Graves, if Mrs. King, the educator, the mother, the visionary, were on this call, what would you feel she would want to leave with everyone who is together today?
Yeah, I think she would encourage young people to use their voice because that's something she did often. And also, in just a moment, I want to kind of show I meant to do it earlier. I want to show our digital exhibition. But I think one of the things Mrs. King would have encouraged all young people to do is to use their voice. That's something that she did, a characteristic that she applied early in her life from her earliest days as kind of a student activist, if you will. She was committed to this idea of using your voice, and because your voice won't matter if you don't use it, right? Your voice won't matter if you don't use it. And so I think the message, and again, I can never speak for Mrs. King. Mrs. King speaks well enough for herself across her, thousands of speeches and her 2 autobiographies. Folks can really understand her heart on this. But I think if there's one thing that young people can take today, it's the power of using one's voice, but also losing the fear of no.
And think about just even being a woman, a Black woman in that time, for her to, I just don't want it to be lost, that the courage it took to use her voice. And if she could use her voice in that time, I just would hope that everyone would be inspired by that.
Most certainly. And if the producer would allow me to share my screen very quickly in terms of voice, I want to share our digital exhibition at the King Center. And for all of the viewers today, you'll be sent the link to be able to access this. Also, for all of the teachers and educators, there's a set of materials that would help you to teach the timeline in your classroom. But this timeline, this digital exhibition, traces 5 periods in Mrs. King's life. So it goes all the way from 1927, right, from her birth all the way to her death in 2006. And in each of these periods, if you click this button that says show events, it unfurls to a set of timeline points that have an associated artifact where literally people can learn and see more about Mrs. King's life, right? Where they can hear her words, understand who she was from the very beginning. So really, we're kind of on a trajectory, or the King Center is the official the official voice when it comes to the legacy of Coretta Scott King. So again, there are videos here that educators and students can tune into to hear Mrs. King speak. And we have for each period, again, as you unfurl, there are associated points that go through kind of these highlights in her life so that young people and learning enthusiasts around the world can really understand the life and impact of Mrs. King.
What an awesome resource, and especially leading up to her birthday on the 27th.
Most certainly.
Yeah. Dr. Graves, thank you. Thank you for losing your fear of no, because it's benefited all of us greatly today. For every time you pursued a yes and didn't have a fear of a no, you gained more knowledge that you've been able to share with us and add to the King Center, and we all benefit from that. So that's a big takeaway today. And thank you so much for your time and what you do each day at the center to continue Mrs. King's work.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was fun. I enjoyed it. Forgive my lapse of popping off. That's what happens when you don't hook up your computer to the power source, right? We've been in the pandemic for like 2.5 years, and I still forget to hook my computer up. So,
oh, that's funny. I told everyone, I said, "Oh, that circle, we're intimately, involved. We all know that circle real well." So it's like not even a second thought.
Right.
Thank you so much. All right, I'll turn it back over to Ian with the King Center now. Thank you, everybody.
Wow. Just a phenomenal conversation. Hello, everyone. Greetings from all over the world. My name is Ian Elmore Moore. I am the director of the beloved Community Leadership Academy, and just an amazing conversation. If you're interested in having more conversations, hearing more conversations about that, about Nonviolence 365, about business, leadership, and entrepreneurship, about technology and innovation. I invite you to really look into the beloved Community Leadership Academy at the KingCenter.org. But special thanks to Ms. Cheryl Preham, just an amazing job. Dr. Kelisha Graves, phenomenal conversation. There's so much to take away, right? Singing as a way to understanding life, right? Just maybe you share in the chat, maybe one word or a takeaway that you had from this great conversation. Legacy for the entire world, right? Not just for her immediate family. Miss Coretta Scott King left a legacy for the entire world. I want to say thank you on behalf of our CEO, Dr. Bernice King. We appreciate you guys attending, listening, watching, and sharing this conversation with others within your network. And I'm asking everyone right now to please complete our survey. If you have your phone, tablet, or maybe you can take a screenshot right now and later on, complete this survey. It helps us further our programming and make sure that we are engaging and impactful. So please take a moment to take a screenshot, take out your mobile device, and complete our survey. I also invite you all to take a look into our new e-learning program called Nonviolence 365 Online, which teaches the philosophy and methodology of Dr. Martin Luther King's nonviolent movement. Again, I appreciate everybody from coming, and please stay connected by visiting and following our social medias at the King Center and thekingcenter.org. Thank you.
Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. The need for man to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to violence and oppression. Man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. changed the world when he demonstrated what could be achieved through nonviolence. Now, you can learn how to live and practice this philosophy yourself through Nonviolence 365 Online, an innovative digital experience developed by the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. Nonviolence 365 Online features extensive video interviews with real nonviolence practitioners, including the King Center CEO, Dr. Bernice King, King Center certified instructors and trainers, and veterans of the civil rights movement. Explorations of the historic campaigns that helped Dr. King forge his philosophy. Immersive, annotated reading experiences that enhance Dr. King's most influential writings on nonviolence. Custom activities, including quizzes and interactive scenarios to help you practice along the way. Real-world exercises to help you start applying nonviolence in your daily life. Nonviolence 365 is a love-centered way of thinking, speaking, engaging, and acting that leads to personal, cultural, and societal transformation. It isn't just a concept for philosophers or political leaders. Nonviolence 365 is a powerful, practical approach to dealing with conflict and dismantling injustice. Whether it's in your personal life, in your school or workplace, your local community, or a national movement. Dr. King, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and many others sought to create the beloved community, a society built on global cooperation and equity. This wasn't a lofty utopian dream. It's a realistic and achievable goal because each and every one of us has the power to make it happen by committing to nonviolence as a way of life. Take the first step today with Nonviolence 365 Online.